Welcome everyone to this presentation on the Mayflower Pilgrims. 2020 of course is the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower crossing from the southern shores of England to the eastern shores of what we now call New England, and there were many events planned and celebrations prepared to mark this wonderful anniversary, and yet most of them so far have been cancelled because of the crisis. Maybe some later in the year will be able to take place as we approach some significant dates in September and November. But in the meantime, it's good for us to be able to just spend a while thinking about the story of these pilgrims, which is legendary, and yet which of course much of the detail is unknown to most people. It was on the 11th of November 1620 that the Mayflower, with its passenger list of 102 people and a few crew, anchored off the coast of the New England shore. And yet the story that began that journey begins actually many years before. Let me first just take the opportunity to point out to you a series of history books and guides produced by Day One. I'm a member of the Day One Council and one of the tour guides to Israel, working with Worldwide Christian Travel. And we have produced a whole host of travel guides and Christian and church history guides, which you may find useful. If you haven't come across them, they may be worth just looking at, and they're a great introduction to church history. They're available through Day One. They're usually £10 a piece, and often they're available for much less than that. We're going to take a very broad brush approach to this whole story. There are lots of twists and turns in it, but we're going to look at it under several headings, and I have entitled them this way. First of all, the birth pangs. We'll look briefly at the backdrop to the decision to flee Europe and to go to the relatively uninhabited shores of North America. The religious backdrop to that is considerable, and much of it will be well known to you, but these are the reasons why the people felt it was imperative to move away from their existing locations to find a place where they could worship God in simplicity and in what they saw to be Bible truth. We'll then think about their troubled youth, not actually in New England at all, but in the years that they spent in Europe, trying to settle in a country which was very tolerant and gave them a great degree of liberty compared to what they experienced back here in England, but the reasons why they eventually felt it was necessary to move on from there. And we'll talk about fleeing the nest, making the decision to embark upon this perilous journey 400 years ago. We're very used to the idea of travel, not right at the moment we aren't, but we're used to the idea of travel. I live near Gatwick Airport. I can just go down the road here, I can get on an airplane, I can be the other side of the world in just a few hours. These folk were going to board a ship, having sold all their possessions and belongings and their homes and their businesses, and they would expect to spend 2.5 to 3 months on board that ship. And they knew that really, having made that journey, they would never do it in reverse. We'll think also about those first steps in the new colony over in New England, the trials and tribulations that they encountered when they arrived there, and the struggles that they had, human struggles and spiritual struggles, to establish the new Plimoth Colony. And then we'll think about some of the growing pains going on from the mid-1600s onwards to the present day. There's a vast amount of twists and turns in the spiritual journey of the church and churches of New England. But we'll just look at the very initial stages of the settlement and some of the difficulties they encountered amongst themselves. So we'll think about the birth pangs. We'll think briefly about the reasons why the folk felt it necessary to make the move and to begin what really was a revolution. The birth pangs really begin with Henry VIII, and you will know something of his religious machinations to suit himself for his wives and his divorces, and the religious upheaval that caused. It's followed then by the all too brief reign of Lady Jane Grey, giving way to the reign of Queen Mary, or Bloody Mary as she's sometimes called, and the persecutions that took place under her reign. She was succeeded, of course, by Elizabeth I, and there were great hopes there with Elizabeth I, who was a reformer to a degree. She was returning the church to its Protestant roots from its Catholic base that it had held under Mary, and there were high hopes amongst the true Christians and believers of those days that Elizabeth would finish the job that she had started, but she never really did. And again, she's succeeded by James I, and he probably proved to be the greatest disappointment of all. There were hugely high hopes under his reign that he would finish the reforms that Elizabeth had failed to complete, and he would purge the church of so many of the rituals that had become attached to it, and that the Puritan folk that we're thinking of, we call them pilgrims because of the journey that they made, but the Puritan folk hoped that under James they would have that freedom and simplicity of worship that they truly longed for. It is a remarkable thing, I think, that such an amazing revolution, such a world-changing event began in tiny little villages all over England, in particular, Suffolk and Norfolk, but also down south too. Here and there, in various villages and towns and some of the cities, there were pockets of true believers, people who really were evangelical Christians and who were simply longing for a purity of worship that they could not find in the established church. People whose names would become very well known amongst anyone who's done any history of the United Kingdom. People like William Brewster, William Bradford, John Smith, Richard Clifton, John Winthrop. These were men in particular who were not separatists. It wasn't their desire to separate from the mother church, from the established church in England. They were truly people who wanted to remain loyal to the king and to the church. But they struggled because they couldn't see and find the biblical warrant for some of the rituals of the church. And it's also true that they were concerned about the lack of true preaching when they attended the church. They had objections to various things and practices of the established church. I don't want to tread on anybody's toes here, but these are the things that upset them. The idea of signing the cross during baptism, the whole idea of confirmation as being unbiblical as they saw it, the administration of baptism by lay people, and in particular the use of the ring in marriage, something that many of us would have undoubtedly upset them with, as we now take that to be a given, a sign of our marriage to another. They didn't like the idea of bowing at the name of Jesus, or the requirement to wear the surplice and the cap in leading worship. They particularly objected to some of the practices which gave men multiple ecclesiastical positions, and they got paid for each of those positions but did nothing in respect of them at all. They were really false shepherds in that sense. And it may be surprising for us, but these Puritan folk were not the drab monochrome parody that we're often presented with today. They were passionate in their desire to follow Christ through his word. And having read some of their descriptions, their biographical descriptions of their experience of Christ, it would lead some of us to blush. in the way that they talked about their relationship with the Lord Jesus. It's also true to say that everything that they did was biblical, and I don't mean to push that too far, but my point is that they saw everything in life through the filter of the Bible. Their times, their experiences, their goals and their ambitions, their families and their churches, their relationships with one another, all of these things were seen through the prism of the Bible. Maybe that's something that would be good for us to do again. We have fallen to some degree into thinking that God doesn't work outside of recorded scripture, but these people knew that God was at work. And there's no doubt that when they eventually stepped from the deck of the Mayflower to the shores of Cape Cod on the 13th of November in 1620, they felt just like Noah. This was a new world. It was a world that had been cleansed and purged, and they had escaped the flood, and they were going to establish a new work and build a new world on spiritual principles. In 1631, a man named Thomas Hooker, he described the fact that many evangelical Christian believers were leaving England. He described that in this way. He said, "So the glory is departed from England, for England has seen her best days, and the reward of sin is coming apace, for God is packing up of his gospel, because none will buy his wares. God begins to ship away his Noahs, which prophesied and foretold that destruction was near." And it wasn't just borrowing a passage from the Bible. This was the lens through which they saw what was happening. At the same time, these spiritual men were drawing crowds to hear their preaching, because it was very different from what they were hearing in the churches. There were illegal meetings, and that probably added to their attractiveness. And these men had a fire in them. They were truly radicals. One man who has the name and the nickname of Robert Trouble Church Brown, he was a radical for sure. And I'm fairly sure that if he turned up in my congregation, I would be telling him about another church down the road where he'd probably be much more comfortable. But he said, "We hold all those preachers and teachers accursed, which will not do the duties of pastors and teachers till the magistrates force them to. They say the time is not yet come to build the Lord's house. They must tarry for the magistrates and parliaments to do it. They lack the civil sword in truth, and the magistrates hinder the Lord's building and kingdom and keep away his government." He was a John the Baptist figure, and he, like many others, had a way of preaching which had a power and a passion which was clearly lacking in the barren established church. Here you can see on the map some of the areas in which clusters of these men and these meetings were taking place. Gainsborough and Scrooby and Austerfield and Babworth. And you can see that just in these tiny villages there were these cores, these centres of what was becoming a revolution in spiritual terms. James I took his position as king in 1603, making his procession down from Scotland, this lavish procession in which he distributed all kinds of gifts and set prisoners free from the prisons and bestowed titles upon people left, right and centre. And as he was making his way to London, some of the Puritan ministers presented him with a petition. It's called the Millenary Petition. And it is a humble and a gracious petition to the king, which shows that they were willing to be subservient to him. It shows that they were not rebellious, they were not seditious, but rather they were seeking that he would do the best for the church over which he held dominion. It begins like this: "Most gracious and dread Sovereign, seeing as it has pleased the divine majesty, to the great comfort of all good Christians, to advance your highness, according to your just title, to the peaceable government of this church and the Commonwealth of England, we, the ministers of the gospel in this land, neither as factious men affecting a popular parity in the church, nor as schismatics aiming at the dissolution of the state ecclesiastical, but as the faithful servants of Christ and loyal subjects to your majesty, desiring and longing for the redress of diverse abuses of the church, could do no less in our obedience to God, service to your majesty, love to his church, than acquaint your princely majesty with our particular griefs." And that truly is a humble and a reverent submission to the king, which really could not have offended him at all, but it did. James I held, of course, the well-known amongst Christian circles, the Hampton Court Conference. The Puritan representatives were invited, but he had already decided they were nothing but trouble. He made them wait for days in the lobby before he even allowed them some means of addressing him, and he had already declared that he would harry them out of the land. It is, of course, a remarkable thing that he commissioned this new translation of the Scriptures, which was the 1611 King James Bible, which is such a precious and wonderful gift to the English-speaking peoples, and even today is esteemed as a translation of the Scriptures. So there's an irony there, but the truth is the Puritan folk got nothing out of the king, only threats, and only the increasing and growing sense that they could not achieve the freedoms they desired unless they went where the king had no actual or real practical influence. For various reasons, the decision was made amongst many of these little congregations that they should move to Holland, where as early as 1590 many other Christians from England had found safe haven, and there was already a well-established meeting of English Christian believers in Holland. And so the decision was made to make their way and to join these folk. There were several attempts, in fact, to make that journey. The initial ones were by chartering ships, but these, certainly the first two, were doomed to failure. In 1607, the Scrooby congregation went to a place named Scotia Creek, which is near Boston. They had chartered a ship and expected to rendezvous with the ship there, but even as the ship was in sight, they realised the master of the ship had betrayed them to the authorities, and he sailed off with their money while they were arrested and detained by the authorities. And some of them were imprisoned briefly. The following year, in Killingholm Creek near Grimsby, they attempted to rendezvous with another ship that they had chartered. There was a delay because of bad weather, and that meant that there were a lot of people hanging around in the locality, in the fields and so on. The local families became aware, the authorities were informed, and things began to get a bit sticky. Eventually, when the ship did appear, a boatload of the men made their way out to the ship, and then a boatload of women seeking to follow them became stuck on a mud bank. The master of the ship could see behind on the hills a crowd approaching, and he knew there was going to be trouble, so he simply abandoned them. So he sailed off with the men, left the women and the children on the mud bank, and then remarkably spent a tortuous 2 weeks getting to Amsterdam. We can't imagine taking 2 weeks to get to Amsterdam today, but because of the bad weather and the storms, that's how long it took. The women and the children had to be rescued, and many of the goods were lost, and it was another disastrous attempt to leave en masse for the Netherlands. What was then settled on was a gradual exodus to the Netherlands. Since 1590, under Francis Johnson and Henry Ainsworth, there had been a congregation in Amsterdam who were known as the Ancient Brethren. There were about 300 of them. And family by family, little group by little group, these disaffected folk from England made their way across to Europe, and they joined with the Ancient Brethren. They retained their sort of English congregational identity, and they would still be called the Scrooby congregation, the Gainsborough congregation. But very soon after those folk came across and settled, it became apparent they were never going to be able to live together. There were divisions about baptism, and there were some concerns, some serious concerns about scandalous conduct amongst the leadership of the congregation there. And so it was decided that those who'd made it from areas like Gainsborough and Scrooby in England, they would move on, and they moved to Leiden under the leadership of a man by the name of John Robinson, evidently a godly man and a much-loved pastor of his people. William Bradford recorded in his writings that the refugees in Leiden enjoyed much sweet and delightful society and spiritual comfort together in the ways of God under the able ministry and prudent government of Mr. John Robinson. And in fact, these folk stayed in Holland and largely in Leiden for about 12 years. But discontentment came in again. It's hard to pin it down, but there seems to be a variety or a combination of factors. If you move to a tolerant society which tolerates you and your worship, it also tolerates other people and their views of things spiritual, and that was a problem for them also. Plus, many years were going by, and many of the Scrooby and Gainsborough congregations in Holland were still stuck with really low-paid jobs. They struggled with the language, and there was great poverty and hardship amongst them. And there was also a real concern about their youth, about their young people. Their young people were simply growing up Dutch, and they were losing the language and culture of their home. And these things, amongst many others, were playing on the minds and hearts of many of those congregations in Leiden, and they began to think that they needed a place where they could start completely afresh. And it is at that point in history that it seemed like the whole world was literally open to them. There were many possibilities, and after much discussion, a vote was taken which set their hearts towards Virginia in North America, eastern North America. And that was interesting because at that time the Anglican Church, the established church, was already there. Now, they had tried hard to escape the influence of the established church, but they were happy to go to a place where it already was existing. Plus, for them, they had heard great stories about the natives of North America who had never heard the gospel of Jesus, and that gave them a genuine motivation to go to this place. In 1619, Deacon Robert Cushman and John Carver of the Leiden congregation went to London to make an arrangement with the Virginia Company to get transport to Virginia and permission to settle there. What they didn't know, because they'd been in Holland all this time, was that the company was in dire straits at the time. Early attempts at settlement in North America had not gone well in some cases, and the company was in desperate need of colonists. But they couldn't provide the free passage that the refugees needed. It would need to be paid for, and these poor folk could hardly afford that. A man called Thomas Weston from London approached the applicants with an offer that seemed too good to refuse, which we know invariably turns out to be too good to be true. Weston, in fact, was a speculator who had contacts with many merchant adventurers who were willing to invest in a new settlement in the colonies. But their motives, of course, were financial, not spiritual. However, it seemed like a great gift to the pilgrims, as we'll call them, and they signed the contract, and he made all the arrangements necessary for the journey to begin. Many of the aspects of the contract were acceptable to the Leiden congregation, but Weston was treacherous and he kept altering it and fiddling with it, so at times they weren't even sure what the agreements and the arrangements were. However, by June 1620 the Mayflower was chartered along with a second ship, the 60-ton Speedwell. The idea was the Mayflower and the Speedwell would travel to New England, and the Speedwell would stay there for the use of the new colony, and the Mayflower would return. The Speedwell was not a great purchase. It was in poor condition and it needed extensive and expensive refitting, including new masts, which were larger than the original. And whilst that might seem like an advantage, actually they were too large, and most likely they put strain on the structure of the ship, which was ultimately to bring about its demise. On the 21st of July 1620, the first would-be settlers made their way to Delft Haven to board the Speedwell. Pastor Robinson from the congregation, their beloved leader, decided he would not travel with them. He preferred to remain with the larger congregation in Leiden for the time being. He preached to them and prayed for them, and with watery cheeks commended them with mutual embraces and many tears they took their leaves of one another. Speedwell drew into Southampton harbour at the beginning of August 1620 and tied up alongside the Mayflower, which had sailed from Rotherhithe for the rendezvous. On board the Mayflower were those recruited by the merchant adventurers for the journey to the new colony. Immediately there were disputes over money spent without proper accounting. Thomas Weston made a further attempt to have the Leiden leaders sign a revised contract, but they refused to do so. More money was spent on the Speedwell, and this, together with harbour fees, necessitated the sale of the poor pilgrims' stores and belonging and food, which they could ill afford to lose. Especially as Weston was now threatening, and to some degree carrying out the threat, to advance them no more funds. You'll see on the map here detail of the attempts to leave for the shores of the new world. The Mayflower came from London and rendezvoused with Speedwell at Southampton. They set off from Southampton on August the 5th, but they both turned back on August the 10th because the Speedwell was leaking, and on August the 12th they arrived at Dartmouth. They stayed at Dartmouth where the Speedwell was repaired, and the folk, some of them were taken in by the locals into their houses, but they had to pay lodgings and provide food for that time. On August the 23rd, both the ships left Dartmouth, and on the 26th, having travelled about 300 miles, they turned back again, and on August the 28th they arrived at Plymouth, and the Speedwell was evidently completely unseaworthy. It would never make the journey across the Atlantic. And to say that this was causing stress amongst the settlers was an understatement. They had sold what little property they had left. They had sold many of their possessions in order to pay for food and lodging. They had attempted to leave 3 times now, and they began to feel that the whole venture was likely to be disastrous for them all. In fact, many of them did abandon the venture completely at Plymouth, which was probably just as well, because they were then going to make the journey with just one ship. And it was on the 6th of September in 1620 that the Mayflower alone departed Plymouth with 102 passengers and 30 crew rammed into a small ship. If you have the opportunity to visit New England and go to the new city of Plymouth, there you will hopefully find the Mayflower II, a recreation of the Mayflower ship. You can go on board, and the first comment that everybody makes when they get on board is, "My, isn't it small?" because it was tiny. You can see the photograph there of one of the decks of the ship, and in order to take the photograph, I'm stood with my back to the wall on one side, and the photograph you see is across the entire deck. And there are a couple of decks like this, but many of the decks, some of the decks were only sort of 5 feet high, no good for anyone to be able to stand up fully. If you could afford it, you could get the carpenter to make you and your family, and perhaps a couple of other families, a little place which you could treat as your own for the journey, but it must have been a thoroughly miserable time. These folk spent 65 days at sea, and it was relatively uneventful. A man named John Howland fell overboard, and he managed to grab a rope as he fell into the sea and was able to be recovered to the ship. After 65 days at sea, the ship finally found itself off of Cape Cod. The goal then was to turn south to reach Virginia, which is where they had the charter and the permission to settle. But every effort to sail south at that point was defeated by the tides, the currents and the weather, and eventually the ship moored just off of Cape Cod. Some of you might know that Cape Cod is sort of shaped like an arm with a bent elbow and a fist, and they moored off the top of the hand, if you like. And off of Cape Cod, they realised that, in a sense, the settlers and the pilgrims realised that their goals and aims had already been defeated. And so they sat down with the men on board from both sides, the settlers and the merchant adventurers, and they drew up again a world famous document which is called the Mayflower Compact. It was an agreement amongst them as to how they would live in the new world they were going to establish, despite the fact that they were, in a sense, two groups there for two different reasons. The Mayflower Compact says that the colonists would remain loyal subjects to King James, despite their need for and desire for self-governance. They would enact and create laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions and offices for the good of the colony and abide by those laws. They would create one society and work together to further it, and that they would live as a body in accordance with the Christian faith. And the Mayflower Compact is signed the 11th of November 1620. It's as famous in many circles as the Magna Carta or the American Declaration of Independence. It's a remarkable document, but it is an acknowledgement that things were not going the way that the spiritual settlers intended them to go. You can see here on the map the arrival on November the 11th, 1620, and the first discoveries, they're called, where people ventured out from the ship. It's interesting to note that though they arrived on the 11th of November, that was a Saturday, the very next day was a Sunday, so they wouldn't leave the ship on a Sunday. Having spent 65 days on board the ship, they stayed there and they worshipped and rested, because that was honouring to the Lord. And it wasn't until the 13th of November that they finally stepped onto the shores of Cape Cod. And from there, over the next few days, they made a series of ventures, of discoveries to find out what the land was like, where they could settle, what they could do, which ultimately resulted in them finding what is now modern Plymouth. If again you've had the pleasure of going to Cape Cod and you've walked along the sandy beaches there under the balmy warm skies and heard the waves gently crashing against the shore, you think, well, this can't be all bad. Well, it can be all bad if you arrive in November and you're about to see one of the many harsh New England winters when even the beaches are covered with several feet of snow. And the whole prospect to them after the great long journey and all of the trials before the journey began must have seemed like it was completely unravelling at that point. Eventually they would relocate to Plymouth Harbour. This was a vast harbour that it was estimated could shelter thousands of ships. And it was on the 16th of December that they relocated to Plymouth Harbour and began the arduous effort to stay alive in a New England winter when most of their supplies that they had brought had actually gone, and they had the disadvantage of having no idea actually how to grow crops or to stay alive in New England. The tragedy is, of course, that the deaths amongst the settlers began even as was they were moored in the harbour. And you can see, overlooking Plymouth Harbour these days, this memorial that marks the death of about 50 people who died in the first months of their arrival. So from 102 settlers, they were now down to 50. They were a mixture of spiritual pilgrims and of tradesmen and speculators. We, of course, will know of Plimoth Plantation, which is a faithful recreation of the first settlement, but we have to remember that it took them a very long time to even begin to settle in those new locations and to build houses. In the early days, they just made shelters from whatever they could find. Sometimes they dug into the side of the hilly land there, and the conditions in which they lived were desperately hard. But as time went on, of course, they began to build houses, and as the first houses were built, many people would have to cram into them, and life was very unpleasant indeed. In the early days of the settlement, Plymouth Plantation, by the way, is not on the actual site of the original settlement. The original settlement is where the modern city of Plymouth is today, and you can find various markers to the different places still in the city of Plymouth. But Plymouth Plantation is a faithful recreation just outside, and it's well worth a visit. Their first contact with natives came. They saw various natives at various times, but those natives didn't hang around to speak to them. Their first contact with the natives really was when a Native American, walked up to them and said, "Welcome, Englishmen." And it was a shock to them to hear a native addressing them in their own language. He was a man by the name of Somerset, and he had come into contact with various fishing expeditions that had come that way and picked up bits and pieces of English. He introduced them to another native called Squanto, and Squanto spoke fluent English. And it turned out that he had actually lived in Cornhill in London, having been at one point captured by slave traders and then through a whole series of twists and turns ended up in England, where he lived in Cornhill in London for a while. He learnt the language, and then he returned to New England and settled there again amongst his people. And it is a truth that Squanto saved the lives of the Pilgrims and taught them those very necessary and vital tricks of the trade to be able to grow crops and corn and so on in the New England countryside, and to fish the seas. The tragedy is that the seas around New England were absolutely teeming with fish and lobster, and these people had no idea how to catch them by and large, but Squanto was absolutely vital to the survival of the settlers in the early days. He introduced them to the chief of the Wampanoag tribe, who were in control of that area, and he sort of was the middleman between the two. Evidently he played both sides, but there's no doubt that he was a wonderful provision for the settlers at that time, who would not have survived had they been without his advice and counsel. Again, overlooking the harbour at Plymouth today, you will see a very imposing statue of Massasoit. He's the chief of the Wampanoag people. Wampanoag means the people of the first light. And he was the chief of this tribe, and I think he knew that the writing was on the wall. These visits from foreigners were becoming more frequent. These people were evidently determined to stay. They had a king who could send huge armies to cause them much grief if he gave them any trouble. And so, to be fair to him, he did work with the settlers, and for many years, in fact, they had a good, if sometimes tenuous, relationship with each other. And there was a good deal of respect between the leaders of the new colony and Massasoit, and the other way round. And for many years the natives and the settlers lived in relative peace. Other ships began to arrive. They had heard good things back at home. It's questionable as to whether the good things they were hearing were really true, because the reality is that life in this new colony was desperately hard. Part of the problem was when new ships came, they swamped the already struggling community. They didn't bring any supplies, they didn't bring any food, they didn't really bring anything that would be necessary to continue establishing the colony. In 1621, a ship called the Fortune arrived with 37 more settlers and brought no supplies at all. Most ships then left and returned to England empty, which infuriated the sponsors. Men like Thomas Weston were absolutely livid that ships would go out to New England, drop settlers, and come back empty. The whole point was that they would return full of the wonderful things of New England. When the Fortune arrived and dropped its cargo of 37 settlers to add to the terrible conditions that were already there, it did return to England full of skins, and in fact the value of those skins alone would have been sufficient to have paid off all the debts of the colony in one go. The tragedy was that on its journey home, the Fortune was seized by the French, and not a penny went into the pockets of their masters at home. The supply ship Anne arrived in Plymouth in the summer of 1623, carrying a further 60 passengers to strengthen the colony. But the scene they found when they arrived, this is 3 years now after the original settlement, the scene they found when they arrived absolutely shocked them to the core. And it is recorded for us that some fell a-weeping, fancying their own misery in what they now saw in others, some pitying the distress they saw. The colonists' clothing was ragged and some were half naked. The only food available was lobster. In those days, to say that seems a little odd for us, but the truth is that lobster was in such huge supply, you became thoroughly sick of it. And in fact, later on, the lawmakers in New England would make a law that banned the serving of lobster to prisoners more than 3 times a week. They believed that eating lobster more than 3 times a week was a punishment that was unbearable. Hopes were further dashed when a drought came between May of that year and July, and the soil was scorched and the crops were ruined. And here is where we see again that the leadership of the colony and the essence of the colony was truly spiritual, because they sensed as one the Lord's displeasure on them. And so what they did in response was to declare a day of prayer and humiliation. On the evening of that solemn day, a gentle rain came and soaked the earth. The immediate effect on the crops was obvious as the withered plants began to quickly revive, but there was an even greater effect on the natives, who noticed that when these people prayed to their God, things happened. The centre of life in the new colony was the meeting house, which had multiple uses. It was their fortress, it was their civic centre, it was their place of worship, and this was completed. It was one of the first things to be completed so that they could be protected. They put a large high fence around the colony because there was always a sense that things could turn nasty with some of the natives, not necessarily the ones they'd built relationship with, but some of the other tribes they knew were very unhappy about the settlement being established there. Thomas Weston by this time was so enraged at the lack of profit coming out of the colony at Plymouth, he actually sent another ship to start another colony at what is now Weymouth nearby, but Plymouth was abandoned as the focus of his efforts, and frustratingly he sent the new colonists to Plymouth to be looked after first before they moved on to Weymouth. Things were not all bad though, and as the early years rolled by and the people became more used to and more skilled at living in this new environment, which had its harshness but it also had its abundance, we get of course the story of the first Thanksgiving, and there is indeed a time when after a good harvest the Pilgrim settlers decided that they would have a time of Thanksgiving, and they sat down at tables to good food, and some of the natives were invited, and this is where the idea of Thanksgiving for the Americans comes. One of the problems they had in the new colony though was that despite all their spiritual ideals and aims, they didn't actually have an ordained minister among them, and in those days that was a problem. If they had no ordained minister, they could not take communion or be baptized, and various other things that were the responsibilities or the province of the minister. In 1624, the first ordained minister, John Lyford, arrived at Plymouth aboard the ship the Charity. He appeared to be a man of great humility, and the settlers were hugely impressed by his humble confessions of previous wrongdoings and of his passionate desire to be united with them in their spiritual quest. He was warmly welcomed among them as a brother in the separatist cause. However, all was not what it seemed. Lyford's sympathies were actually with the established church, and his previous wrongdoings turned out to be much more sordid than even he had been prepared to admit, including possibly the rape of a young girl he'd been counselling. Lyford became a thorn in the colonist side and began writing letters back to England disparaging the colony and its leaders. There were growing pains. Many ships were now pointing their bows in the direction of the New World, New England, and other ships were sailing to other points north of Plymouth. Some of them had learned and heard of the lessons of the Plymouth Colony and its struggles and failings, and they decided to bypass it completely. We have the Weymouth Colony, but more importantly and significantly, up to the north at Salem, various expeditions began to turn. The Massasoit Bay Company was formed by John Winthrop back in England, and it had as its motto, "Come over and help us," from the book of Acts, a native pleading to hear the gospel. And that was the motivation for John Winthrop and his Massasoit Bay Company. And they raised together in 1630 a flotilla of 11 ships, which had 700 men, women and children, 200 cattle, 60 horses, and they sailed to Salem, which is north of present-day Boston, and then eventually those settlers would move south and establish the city. First it was called Tri-Mountain, then it became known as Boston. And you remember, perhaps some of you will know of the City on a Hill sermon preached at that time, where the settlers were encouraged to remember that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God and all professors for God's sake. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us, till we be consumed out of the good land whither we are going. They believed that their conduct in the New World was the focus of the whole world's attention, and that there was glory to God involved in this and honour to his church. From 1634 into 1635, about 4,000 people made the journey to New England. And from these centres in the north particularly, but also from Plymouth now, which is finding its feet, various others moved out and established new settlements in and around New England and to the north of New York, as it became known. And as they planted these different settlements, they established and built churches. And then during that time, of course, they began to run into the old problems. People began to turn up who didn't agree with them over their ways of worship and of churchmanship. 1631, Roger Williams came, who is famous for his attitudes and for his freedom of conscience and liberty in terms of worship. And he was constantly butting against the established pilgrims there because they just weren't separate enough from the established church, and eventually he was driven away from the colony to Providence, Rhode Island. Another person who came was a lady by the name of Anne Hutchinson. She'd been a faithful member of John's Cotton Church in St Botolph's in England. And she had strong reformed views, and she followed her beloved Cotton, her pastor, her minister, to New England, and she started Bible studies mostly for women in the home, and at times 80 people would go to her house for Bible study, and some of her teachings began to attract attention, and John Winthrop called her to account. She refused to desist, and eventually she was put on trial. It's noted that at her trial she was pregnant with her 15th child. But it's also noticed that she generally held her prosecutors at bay. and seemed to be winning the argument until the close of the second day, when she said that she had received direct revelation from God and no one was going to stand by her, not even her beloved Pastor John Cotton at that point. And she was excommunicated from the colony, and eventually she moved with 7 of her children to what's now the Bronx in New York. Sadly in 1643 she and 6 of her children were murdered by natives of the Suwanoi tribe, who were disaffected by the New Netherlands settlement. The Quakers came. In 1656 the ill-fated Speedwell finally made an appearance in Boston Harbour, bringing with it several members of the Quaker religion, who were also suffering persecution in England. They were detained on the instructions of John Endicott, the governor at the time, and subsequently banished from the colony and sent back to England. Around the same time, a lady by the name of Mary Dyer returned from England, where she had become a Quaker. She was persistent in teaching the Quaker religion, and she was constantly warned by the authorities that she was not allowed to do this, and eventually she was imprisoned and detained for 3 months until her husband undertook to secure her permanent removal from the colony. Sadly, despite this, she continued afterwards to promote the religion, and she suffered as a consequence and was eventually put to death. And what the settlers found themselves doing was enforcing rules to protect the spiritual life of the colony. In other words, they began doing what they had fled from back in England. Relationships with the natives, as more and more settlers came to New England, began to break down. So I just realised the slides there are not up, but you've got Roger Williams on the top left, you've got Mary Dyer there in the middle, and you also have Anne Hutchinson there on the right hand side, all people who suffered for their disagreement with the spiritual principles and purposes of the settlers. Relationships with the natives began to break down, largely through a series of misunderstandings and some clumsy actions and some careless treatment of the natives. Massasoit died, and his son met a comet. He became known as King Philip by the English because of his haughty attitude. They called him King Philip, and he was mishandled by the settlers too, who dealt with him in a very clumsy way. And there were a series of grievances that upset him, and it began to foster resentment and bitterness towards the settlers. And so King Philip met a comet began to carry out some illegal actions as far as the agreement with the settlers was concerned. He began selling land and buying weapons and currying favour with other tribes. Eventually it came to a point of crisis, and Philip was determined to go to war against the English, but their powwow, their spiritual leaders said that the English must take the first blood. Now that actually happened in 1675 when a raiding party of natives was caught in an English settlement. They were fired on and one of the raiders was injured. That was good enough, and the conflict quickly spread, and other tribes were drawn in. English settlements were attacked, and as other tribes actually took the fighting forward, Philip became less and less relevant to the conflict. But over the next couple of years it would take a heavy toll upon both the English settlements and the natives, and in a sense it was a war that no one could win. The English were on a back foot, largely because they just didn't understand the environment, and the natives were able to cross the various swamps and forests with relative ease, whereas the English settlers and their armies as such were unable to do so. And eventually the natives had made their way to a mountain where they realized they couldn't spend another winter, and they began to look for a way to end the conflict with some honour. The great sadness as well about this was that converted Native Americans who'd become Christians, were viewed with real suspicion during this time of war, and the praying Indians, as they were called, were rounded up and banished to an island in the middle of Boston Harbour in the middle of winter, and it cost the lives of many of them. The conflict ended in 1678. By that time Philip was dead now, and the natives were starving and defeated, and the war began to peter out. But it had taken a terrible toll upon both communities, and neither of them would recover in their relationships from these events. Various others began to arrive in the New World, and there were various other conflicts which took place on a spiritual level as well as a physical level. The battles were not only fought with muskets and spears, but there were spiritual battles too. When the Baptists arrived and settled or attempted to settle in New England, of course they found themselves at odds with the Puritan settlers. And the early Baptists certainly were subject to penalties and to imprisonment, and on a couple of occasions Baptist leaders were publicly whipped. A Baptist meeting house in North End of Boston was nailed shut, and a notice was affixed that all people were to take notice by the order of the court that the place was not to be used as a religious meeting house. The members of the little Baptist fellowship there held a service outside in the cold and rain, but the following week the doors were open and the meetings took place without further interference. It's true to say that for many of the settlements begun by these spiritual pilgrims with high hopes and with great integrity in those early days, that many of them today have all but disappeared in terms of their spiritual influence. Unitarianism swept across the entire region, and many of the gospel believing evangelical Christians found that their churches gave way to teachings that were not at all to their liking. And today, if you go to New England, it's a real mixture, it's a real hodgepodge of different kinds of churches. Well, friends, that's all we have time for at this point, but it gives us, I hope, an introduction to and an overview of the reasons why these folk found it necessary to leave their home country and travel to the other side of the world, endure incredible hardships. Their goals primarily were spiritual and their motives were good. And the truth, of course, is that what these humble folk did 400 years ago changed the world. And now today their story is being celebrated this year, and we hope and pray that later on in the year some of those events and celebrations that have been planned will be able to take place. And I'd encourage you just to look on the internet for Mayflower 400, and you might find that there are events taking place near you that you can engage in and mark this remarkable event. Thank you for listening. I hope it's been helpful, and God bless you all for taking the time to pay attention to this presentation.